Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Brad Keithley. I'm president of Keithley Consulting, LLC, and I'm here to talk about the sustainability of the Alaska budget. This is sort of the revenue side, if you will, of a forward look at the revenue side of the state's revenue stream. Most of the last 2 days we've been concentrated on the expense side, the spending side, the cost side of education. This is to sort of give an overview of what the revenue side looks like. Normally I do this either in conjunction with or by deferring to Scott Goldsmith, who is Dr. Scott Goldsmith, an economist with the Institute of Social and Economic Research. Dr. Goldsmith is on vacation, so I drew the short straw in terms of making the presentation. There's an intermingling of slides from Scott's normal presentation and my normal presentation, and so that explains the difference between the two. This presentation really can be made in 3 slides. I've got a few more in here, but there's three slides that are important. The first one is probably the most important. This is a look at where the state is going based upon the course, at least that one could foresee or that one can foresee from the fall 2012 revenue book, which is the last revenue book that is complete, and making some historic or applying some historical percentages in looking forward. This is an analysis of the state's spending curve, and these are all unrestricted general fund numbers. The state's spending curve and an analysis of the revenues plotted against that spending curve. The black line that begins on the left-hand side at about $6 billion, $6.8 billion, $7 billion, somewhere in that range, is expanded at the rate of about 4.5% per year, or at the rate of 4.5% per year, and that shows the spending. That black line then forms the state spending line. That 4.5 is conservative. 4.5% is conservative compared with what the state's experienced over the last 10, 15 years, which has been more in the 6% range. The lines, or the pieces below it, represent various sources of revenue. The brown at the very bottom is non-oil revenue, which is basically corporate income taxes and a few other sources of revenue that roughly equal about $500 million a year. The green that's above it is DOR's forecast. This is in the fall book again. DOR's forecast of oil revenues going out over the next 10 years, and then trended by Dr. Goldsmith on the same decline curve from that point forward. The next skin above that, the light green, is new oil that starts showing up at the end of the 10-year period from 2013 to 2023, and then again is trended out by Dr. Goldsmith. And then Dr. Goldsmith adds the blue, dark blue skin that's on top of the light green is Dr. Goldsmith's estimation of revenues from a potential natural gas line, an LNG line. I've looked at the assumptions behind those figures, and frankly that's fairly robust. It assumes a fairly high Pacific Rim LNG price with a fairly high netback, fairly low cost and fairly high netback to the field. So that, if anything, in my opinion, and I've been dealing with LNG for a long time, in my opinion that's a fairly robust projection. And then the red is the use of the statutory budget reserve or the constitutional budget reserve to fill in the difference between the spending line and the revenue line. Now, when you look at the OMB forecast that's provided to the legislature in December of every year along with the budget, you only see a 10-year forecast. And so when you look at the OMB forecast, certainly the one provided with the current budget, provided back in December for the budget the legislature considered last session, it showed revenues adequate to meet spending through the entire 10-year forecast, and it showed accomplishing that through using the statutory budget reserve and the constitutional budget reserve, and so it didn't show a fiscal gap showing up. It showed reliance on savings, certainly, but it didn't show a fiscal gap showing up. What the ICER study does, which is the source of this data, a study done earlier this year, January of this year, before the session started. What the ICER study does is project beyond that 10 years and show where we're headed as a result of what the current revenue forecasts are and applying that spending after we use up the SBR and the CBR, because the SBR and the CBR are used up by the end of the 10-year period, and we start going into what I call the twilight zone occasionally, because there is no additional revenue source to fill the gap between spending and oil revenues. Now, there have been a couple of changes to the factors that are depicted here that one could say would show a different chart if you were doing it today, if you had the data to be able to do it today. One is the legislature adopted a $6.8 billion budget, actually 7.1, but you could say it's a $6.8 billion budget this past legislature. And the governor in April, as I'll come on to in a bit, said we're going to stick at $6.8 billion with exceptions, but we're going to stick at $6.8 billion for the next 5 years. So you could say that spending line, at least over the next 5 years, is, by escalating at 4.5%, you're overstating the amount of spending. But by the same token, this chart was done based upon the assumption of a continuation of ACES. It was done based on assumption of the fall revenue book, which had applied the current tax rate and the current tax structure, which was ACES, which shows a higher revenue level than the revenue level which would show under SB 21. And if you make those two adjustments by reducing spending to 6.8, assuming that 6.8 is the right number and assuming the exceptions don't result in an escalation of that number in any event, but if you assume the spending number comes down to 6.8, then you make the adjustments to the revenue line, the revenue forecast, the deficit that shows up, the draw on the SBR and the CBR shows up to be roughly exactly the same. So this is an accurate depiction, maybe not in terms of exactly where the curves are, but in terms of the draw on the SBR and the CBR that we're currently on, is an accurate depiction of what's going on. The conclusion that was drawn by ICER, and for those watching online, that's the Institute of Social and Economic Research. It's the analysis arm that's within the University of Alaska Anchorage system. The conclusion that they drew is that after reviewing the data and reviewing this graph, is that reasonable assumptions about potential new revenue sources suggest we do not have enough cash in reserves to avoid a severe fiscal crunch soon after 2023, and with that fiscal crisis will come an economic crash. That's the ICER conclusion about the direction that the state's headed, and it points us directly toward, and if we stay on the current course or if we stay on the modified course of keeping spending at 6.8 and then taking into account the SB 21 revenues, it puts us on the course of having a severe situation, economic situation in this state in the early 2020s. Now, usually when I give this speech, somebody by now will pop up and say, oh, we've heard that before, and we've heard it before, and we've heard it before, that we're always going to run into these economic crises, and they never happen. The reason that we've heard them before, the reason that we hear them before, is this state has gone through a history, as has the oil industry, of a depression in oil prices. And so what has really happened in our economic crashes before is that the bottoms dropped out of the oil price, and the revenues that we've counted on based upon that oil price have disappeared. This situation is entirely different. We always, before, when we had these crashes, we always continued to have fairly high production. So when oil prices recovered, when we had the crash in oil prices, revenues went down. When oil prices recovered, we had the production that then the oil prices applied to, and we came out of the economic situation. We came out of the state spending situation that we found ourselves in. This situation is different. We have high oil prices. This is assuming fairly robust oil prices. If you look at the DOR projections of the revenue that underlie these revenue streams, these are higher oil prices than we're experiencing right now, and frankly, that industry would predict we're going to experience. So the revenue numbers are frankly higher than what I think you would see if you used industry numbers. And we're at fairly strong, I think the general perception is we're at fairly strong oil prices now. So this is not a crash that's being created by a drop in oil prices. This is a crash that's being created by staying at fairly strong oil prices, indeed robust oil prices, but as a consequence of the production declines. I know that there's been some discussion about where production's heading. I have a slide that I'll come on to in a minute that will talk about that. Trust me, it really doesn't make, and I'll explain this in a moment, but it doesn't make any difference whether you're talking about ACES or you're talking about SB 21. Based upon current spending levels, this is where we're going. This is the economic situation the state is facing in a fairly short period of time. There are a couple of slides that Dr. Goldsmith includes in his presentation that I've included here to sort of provide some context. This is the history of Alaska petroleum revenues throughout time from 1977 to 2012, and you can see we went through a fairly high level of revenues in the early 1980s. Then we went through the crash. When we came out of the crash, we're in a fairly strong uptick in revenues. We've been on a fairly strong uptick in revenues for the past few years. But that has been matched over that period by a fairly strong uptick as well in spending in the state. Just see these statistics that I always find interesting. During the Frank Murkowski administration, the 4 years of the Murkowski administration, we averaged about $2.5 billion in unrestricted general fund spending. That is operating and capital combined. During the subsequent 4 years with ACES and following ACES, the average budget went up to about $4.75 billion. The last 4 years, the state unrestricted general fund budget has been $6.75 billion on average. So what's happened is as oil prices and oil values have gone up and our tax rate went up, we've managed to spend it all as we've gone along. The consequence is, to go back to the first slide, we have some in the SBR and the CBR, but it only gets us through, even if we start drawing it, it only gets us through the end of this decade into the early part of the next decade. And that's the spending slide. This is the DOR projection of petroleum revenues that was in the fall 2012 book again, that shows the drop-off in oil revenues. And again, for those looking online or for those behind me or for those on the task force, this is ACES. These are the projections of oil revenues under ACES. So this is not a situation where we're going into this economic crisis, as some might argue, because we've switched tax structures. We're headed there either way, not because of the tax structure, but because of the spending that the state has been on and the projections of where that spending continues to go. So you can see oil revenues declining on down. The lines get the projections until about 2023 are projections that are taken straight from the fall book that are made by DOR. The more shaded lines or the more hazy lines beyond that are the projections that Dr. Goldsmith did based upon the trend lines that were in the fall revenue book. As I said before, while it may soften the outcome, SB 21 does not change it. The charts that are important to this are on the right-hand side, the ones you can't see, but I'll tell you, or can't see the detail, I'll tell you what they contain. These are charts that were done at the end of the last legislative session when SB 21 was in House Finance and the final analysis and final changes to SB 21 were being made. These incorporate the changes that were made by the House that were then passed on the House Finance Committee, that were then passed on the House floor and passed by the Senate. So this reflects ACES or SB 21 as it was passed, and it's a comparison of revenues under various assumptions. The red bar on the left are the revenues, anticipated revenues from ACES. The blue bars are anticipated revenues from SB 21. Assuming all incremental oil, all oil over the DOR decline curve is new oil, and thus under the lower tax rate that SB 21 provides. The green bars are an estimate of the revenues under SB 21 if if the incremental oil, the oil above the otherwise anticipated decline curve is 50% new oil and 50% legacy oil, old oil, at the higher tax rate. It really doesn't make a difference much what assumptions you make as to SB 21. The results are pretty, between incremental and new oil, or old oil and new oil, the results are pretty much the same. The differences in the bars assume different decline rates. And so the first blue bar and the first green bar are lower because they assume a 6% decline in oil, that oil production continues to decline at 6%. The next bar over is that oil declines at 3%. The next bar over is that oil declines at 1%. And the final bar, the highest bar on both the blue side and the green side, is assuming that oil stays at 0% or 0% decline, it stays flat. These calculations are done for 30 years. So this is the net present value, the annual average expected net present value of oil revenues over 30 years, assuming these decline rates. And there are charts for, there's a series of charts that are in this presentation. I believe they go from $90 a barrel to $140 a barrel to reflect what I think industry's best thinking is currently with respect to where prices are going to be, real prices are going to be over that period of time. I've chosen the $100 and the $110 price range. The best scenario that you get out of these charts, $110 assuming zero decline over 30 years. That is, oil production stays flat over 30 years. We find enough new oil to offset natural decline in the reservoirs to keep oil production flat over the 30 years. The best scenario is that, and this assumes that 50% of the new oil is coming from the legacy fields, which is a fairly high assumption, is that the annual revenue is going to be $6.1 billion. And this is against a current budget of $6.8 billion, a statement by the governor that he's going to keep spending at $6.8 billion with exceptions over the next 5 years, and then some assumption about escalations of spending after that. We never get back there. Even under SB 21, even under a 0% decline curve, which is no decline in production, new oil offsets declines, and we have 0% decline overall. The best scenario at $110 a barrel is $6.1 billion. So we're never getting out of this hole. We're under SB 21, under ACES, under either assumption, we're not getting up to even current spending rates, much less having any additional revenue over the future. In my estimation, based upon a lot of experience in dealing with the oil industry in Alaska and dealing with the oil industry worldwide, best case, we're probably looking at, over a 30-year period, we're probably looking at a decline rate of between 3% and 1%. Under SB 21, I think there are adequate incentives under SB 21 to improve the decline rate where we're going to be under ACES. The revenue numbers, the long-term revenue numbers under average annual net present value number for revenue at a 3% decline in the $110 case is $4.4 billion of revenue, oil revenue per year. At 1% decline, if we were so lucky to have 1% decline, it would be $5.4 billion. And that assumes that 50% of the incremental oil is new oil over the 30 years, and 50% and 50% is coming from the legacy fields. If you assume it's all coming from the new fields, the numbers are $4.3 billion on the revenue side, annual average over the next 30 years, and 5.2 at a 1% decline. So if you go back to the beginning and you look at the first slide, which is where we are based on ACES and where we are based upon spending patterns, we hit a crash in the early 2020s. If you assume that we go to SB 21, you assume the charts that were provided to House Finance are a reasonably accurate prediction of where we're headed. Based upon current spending levels, we still hit a crash. We hit a crash probably slightly later than under ACES, but we still hit a crash sometime in the fairly early 2020s. There also, in my opinion, and I do consulting with potential investors, a lot of potential investors looking at the state. In my opinion, even those numbers are fairly soft. Oil you have to understand a little bit the dynamics of oil investment. Oil investment is for new fields and new developments is you put a lot of money up front and you look at a revenue stream coming out over time. That's what the left-hand chart really depicts. The bars in the left-hand chart are investment levels, and the red line is really revenue levels. So investment is heavily front-end loaded. You put a lot of investment up front, and then you get your revenue stream out over time. You don't make the investment up front. You don't put in those upfront dollars unless you think the revenue stream is fairly secure and you're going to get the revenues that you anticipate that are going to be competitive with your alternatives in the world over time. Investors, oil companies are very sophisticated investors. And when they analyze whether they're going into an area, they not only look at geologic risk, they not only look at market risk, but particularly where the state owns the resource and where the state has a significant tax structure, they also look at what the potential state take is over the time that revenue stream is going to be coming. And if you look at the potential for major new, if you look at the general revenue curve you see for major new investments, and you overlay that on where our fiscal crisis is going to show up, you see that the big chunk of the revenue stream that major investors would look at by making a new investment, significant investment in oil reserves in this development of oil reserves in the state, that where that revenue is going to show up is overlaying just about the time we hit the fiscal crash. And these are sophisticated investors, and so they make an assessment of what's going to happen when the state hits that fiscal crash, and at least they put some weight, frankly significant weight, on the likelihood that the state will change its tax structure again to deal with that fiscal crisis, increase the tax rates on oil, and frankly make that revenue stream that they've based the projection on based upon SB 21 rates just totally wrong. So they will factor in the fact that we have a fiscal crisis coming up, an unresolved fiscal crisis coming up, assess that in looking at the revenue stream, will depress the revenue stream or deflate the revenue stream to account for the risk of having an increased tax rate once we hit the fiscal crisis, and the economics of making those initial investments frankly won't stack up with what you've got the rest of the world. We essentially back into an ACES problem because investors are looking at the reinstitution of tax rates that are along the lines of ACES, if not worse, along the lines of ACES out in the sweet spot of the revenue stream. They'll never make the investments in the first place. If they don't make those investments, it's unlikely to think we're going to hit the 0% or the 1% or the 3% decline rates that are anticipated in the SB 21 numbers. In other words, we won't make these numbers on this chart if we don't get that are anticipated from SB 21. If we don't get the investments that produce that sort of revenue curve, if we don't solve the fiscal crisis, if we aren't able to prove to investors that we've got our fiscal house in order and they're not going to have to reap the consequences of the fiscal crisis, then they'll never make the investments in the first place. We'll get this in a second. They'll never make the investments in the first place that are necessary to produce those sorts of revenue bars.
Mr. Helcrow, did you have a question on this slide?
I did. Thank you very much. Mr. Keithley, bills. And I'm going to take issue with this just simply because I've been through these battles, and I mean pitched political battles. I don't agree that Alaska will not attract significant long-term investment because of our fiscal cliff, and I'll tell you why. In 1999, 2000, we had $1.2 billion left in the CBR. With our budget deficit, we were literally a year and a half, 2 years away from being out of money. Nobody believed us. And the reason they didn't believe us was because companies were investing. During that time, you had the Century 16 theaters were built. You had retail stores move in, Old Navy and Gap moved into the Diamond Center. You had restaurants being built. The investment in what the oil companies did is basically that was, you'll remember, that was an era of incredible consolidation. I mean, Conoco and Arco and BP all kind of did their split, but we got rid of Arco. And so what the industry did was because of the fiscal situation and because of the price of oil, they just simply realigned their business model. In one of my problems with this, and I don't disagree that the state has an issue going forward. We've always known that. But I would argue that keeping the budget, as Governor Parnell has said, over the next 5 years at $6.8 billion, is completely unrealistic. I mean, it is absolutely, positively, completely unrealistic. I mean, you know, when you look at things like this, in the last 4 years, corrections up 39%, courts 29%, Hess 29%, governor's budget 22%. I mean, these are continuing to grow. In things like corrections, in court, in health services will continue to grow, A, because we haven't gotten a grip on, you know, the economy and education and making sure we're doing enough measures to get down the court number or the corrections number. But more importantly, you know, we're just simply not going to walk away from obligations of corrections or courts. I mean, we have to fund those things. And I would argue education is certainly one of those components. I mean, you know, through the years that we had no money, I mean, we never, ever cut education. We maybe didn't give it a huge increase or kept it flat, but we never, ever cut education. And I can't see any legislature in the future saying, okay, we're going to just leave you flat. Because the governor's assumption means last year we spent, what, 5.8 on operations and $1 billion on the capital. So there are other economic factors, and certainly I see these every day and talk to folks, for instance, in the construction industry. Here's the concern. Over the last 3 or 4 years, the legislature has invested a ton of money in capital budgets. And that money is slowly working its way through the system. So when you go forward, I believe, and I certainly see it and hear it on a daily basis through my members, is that what we're doing is we're creating a false economy. We're out there building all these buildings, doing this, creating a level of expectation for the economy. As we ratchet that money back, that's fine, because I'm a firm believer that the capital budget is way too high. But having said that, what you're going to do is you're going to shift costs to local governments and local school districts, and they're simply not going to stand for it. And these 3 lawmakers are going to have people in their office every day of the week for 90 days telling them their stories. And I just, simply being through these battles, I don't believe it. I don't believe the governor for the next 5 years can hold spending at $6.8 billion. Not when you've got an aging demographic, a growing corrections population, an in-migration of lower-income folks who are relying on Medicaid. I mean, all of these economic factors make me convinced that this idea that we're going to hold the budget flat for 5 years is a dream. I mean, I don't see where it's ever been done in the past. I don't see, with our costs being driven in four departments over the last 4 years, have grown as a percentage greater than education. And those departments aren't going to stop with the changing demographics. So again, I mean, I appreciate the work you've done. I just think it's unrealistic for the governor or anybody else to say, for the next 5 years, we're not going to spend a dime more than either $5.5 billion or $6.8.
Well, you made 2 points. Let me make responses to each, if I may. One is what your argument is that we're going to hit the wall sooner than 2023, because this chart, the chart on the first page, is assuming that spending is held, and when you factor in SB 21, it's assuming that spending is held around in the $6.8 billion level. If we have SB 21 revenues and we have higher spending, higher than level spending, then the SBR and the CBR are consumed faster than what this chart assumes. So that assumes we hit the wall faster. that we hit in the late teens as opposed to in the early 20s. As to oil investment, so if you're right, we're in worse shape than this chart shows. As to oil investment, I'll say two things. When I sit with these companies every week, and I hear what they're saying, and there's a difference. There's two things to be said. One is this chart assumes that investments go off at sort of the historic rate. So this chart is assuming that you're right, that there isn't a softening of investment, and that we continue to get the same level of investment we've gotten in the past. And so that shouldn't make us any more comfortable, because if spending's going up, investment, even if investment's staying the same, but with revenues on the decline, again, we consume the SBR and the CBR faster. The reason I make the point on this chart that I think investment is going to soften is I sit with companies who have alternatives in the world, and there's a difference between the late 1990s and the early 2000s and what we're faced today. And the difference is the opportunities in the world have exploded in a way that to be much broader than they were in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. More of the world has opened up. Russia is open in a way that it wasn't before. China is open in a way that it wasn't before. We're now having significant finds in Africa, gas finds off of East Africa, significant oil finds in addition in West Africa. We are having, but probably, and we're having additional finds off Brazil that we didn't have in that era, and additional investment in that era. Probably the most significant difference is shale that's occurred that started during that time period and has opened up a whole bunch of new investments, not only in the lower 48 and in Canada, but increasingly elsewhere in the world that are giving investors additional opportunities, additional places to put their money that they didn't have during that time period. So when you say, yeah, we continue to get some investment in that time period, even though we saw a crash coming, we're not going to see that same level of activity today, because there are more places in the world with better economics to put an oil investment in these days than there were in those days. But even assuming for the moment that you're right, and I would suggest you're not, but even assuming for the moment you're right, what you're suggesting is if increases continue spending, we're in worse shape than what the ISER report is showing, because if spending is going to go up faster, we're not going to get any better revenue lines than what ISER is showing, and the SBR and the CBR are going to be consumed faster.
And I wouldn't disagree with your assessment that we'd hit the wall sooner. But I'm just making what I think is a very, very realistic point, that this idea that we're going to hold the budget at $6.8 million for the next, or $6.8 billion for the next 5 years, I simply don't believe it. And I do agree. I think, compared to 2000 or 1999, there's significant global opportunities. That was one of the reasons why, some of us pushed for SB 21, because Alaska was no longer competitive. But, I too, during these pitched fiscal battles, I mean, the oil companies back in 2002, when we were 2 years away from being out of money, they had no faith in the legislature to address it. I mean, they knew that politically this was a difficult conversation, which it is now, because lawmakers, look, no offense, but lawmakers are very averse to making tough decisions. And so I guess what I'm saying is the industry has known for a very, very long time that Alaska has a very iffy fiscal situation. And I guess when, again, we passed SB 21, I talk to oil industry executives, the investment's coming. You've got Exxon up there at Point Thompson investing a significant amount of money. I mean, obviously these companies feel okay. I mean, if I'm Exxon and I'm worried about the fiscal situation, am I out in Point Thompson? I mean, tell me I'm wrong.
Point Thompson, in the big scheme of things, is not a lot of money. It's not a lot of investment, and it's not going to produce a lot of production. It's not what we need. It's not anywhere near the type of investment that we need. What you're talking about is they're maintaining investment. They're maintaining investment sufficient to maintain that 6% decline curve, softened a little bit. to account for some new oil. But we're not talking about and that's what we had in the the late 1990s and the early 2000s. We had investment that maintained a production decline in the range of 6%. What SB 21 assumes is we're going to go to production declines of 0% or 1% or 3%. That is a significantly different level of investment that's required to get to those levels than what's required to maintain at 6%. And we're not seeing those. We're not seeing statements by the companies that they're going to that they're making those investments, that they're going into heavy or viscous, or they're significantly expanding into new fields on state lands or even on lands subject to production tax. We're not seeing that. We're seeing, so if you look at this curve, the Toro curve on the left-hand side, you see two curves. You see a curve, the big curve in red, and then you see a smaller curve in dotted lines out to the right-hand side. And what that represents, and you see some spikes in investment about the time, if I can do this, right in there. So you see some higher blocks, some investments in this period of time, late in the field life, and you see some production response to that. Those are investments, smaller investments that will spike production somewhat, certainly not on the same order of magnitude as the bigger investments, but will spike production for a period of time as a result of smaller investment levels. And what's really key about those is they'll pay out relatively quickly. You get a fairly quick, immediate, fairly quick investment production response, as opposed to the major investments that give you a take more money and give you a longer production response. What we're seeing right now, the type of announcements we're seeing right now, are the type that are at the back end of this chart. We're seeing relatively significant compared to what we've seen in a while, but we're seeing relatively small investment levels that are going to give us a small and relatively quick production bump before the fiscal cliff hits. That's the type of investments you're going to get. We're not seeing announcements of the major investments to go after major new production sources that are going to give us the type of long-term production decline that are assumed in the SB 21 analysis. It says we're going to go to 0, 1, and 3%, 0, 1, or 3% decline rates. So we're seeing some, yes, but we're not seeing the type that we need to move the production levels in significant ways.
In a follow-up. Okay, so when you talk about, and we've all seen the press releases, when you talk about there's no movement into long-term production or heavy production, I mean, look, I was an advocate of SB 21, but that was what this was supposed to do, was to stimulate investment. Yeah. So even with SB 21, are you telling me that there's no firm commitments to do the heavy lifting?
I'm telling you there isn't, because we're seeing that fiscal cliff out there. The companies are not going to make significant long-term major investments that are predicated on long-term payouts, long-term revenues, as long as that fiscal cliff sits out there. We're going to continue to see these sorts of back-end smaller investments that produce quick bumps in production.
Okay, so on the other end of that, so companies aren't going to invest because of the fiscal cliff, but they are going to invest if basically we hold government funding flat, we have a substandard education system, and all of these growing concerns like courts and in prisons and things. I mean, I'm not quite sure. I know it's not like I'm not quite sure. I just fundamentally disagree. I mean, I don't disagree with Scott Goldsmith's numbers, but I think you need to put the numbers to the political reality, and you also need to put the numbers to, as we did 12 years ago, actually come up with a plan to help address the fiscal gap. I mean, that was one of the things. I mean, oil was $9 a barrel. There was no increasing oil taxes on the oil company. So we had to go back in, look at the budget, and this was back when we were spending a combined $2.8 billion between capital. So now you've got 6.8. You've got $4 billion more on the books, and I think this is one of those things that really frustrates me and always frustrated me as a lawmaker, is there is no long-term vision in this state. There's no long-term vision for us beyond oil. There's no long-term vision for investments in education or these kinds of things. And so every 10 or 15 years, we go through one of these crises, but it never gets resolved because of the political climate.
Well, there is long-term vision, and it's contained in the ICER analysis. A sustainable budget concept is a long-term vision. Now, it doesn't produce $6.8 billion in revenue, but frankly, we have to come to grips with the fact that we're not a $6.8 billion revenue state. We are a state that's going to have to survive and deal with and accommodate and live on and adjust ourselves to a lower revenue stream. If we do that, if you look at the ICER analysis and you look at a sustainable budget model, if we do that, we can have a great state for a long period of time. The ICER budget, the sustainable budget model says if we go to $5.5 billion now and save the remainder, put the remainder in savings, essentially build a 401k account for the state, and build up a financial asset that when oil declines, when oil revenues decline out in the future, that financial asset will produce revenues sufficient to maintain state funding at $5.5 billion, virtually ad infinitum, in perpetuity. We're in the state is in the position right now of a guy in his late 30s, and the guy in his late 30s has a certain income stream. And he's faced with the choice of, do I take a portion of that income stream and do I put it into my 401k account and start building that financial asset I'm going to need when I'm no longer going to have the earnings capacity I have now, and have that 401k account to generate revenue when I reach my retirement to continue to have a great life, or do I take that revenue stream and spend it on things that I want now, like new buildings, new in the state's case, new buildings, new roads, new whatever this or that. In an individual's case, buying a new four-wheeler, buying a new snow machine, having a cabin, taking vacations to Hawaii, having a nice house, and not putting it into the 401k account. Alaska's making the choice now, frankly. If you look at where we're headed, we're making the choice now of buying all the trinkets and not having anything saved up when our revenue stream declines. What the ICER model is, what the sustainable budget model is take a portion of that revenue stream, put it into a 401k account for the state, and have revenue out there in the future, virtually in perpetuity, have revenue out there in the future when oil revenues decline. But to do that, to achieve that bright future, you have to temper your expectations now. Just like the guy in his late 30s can't spend all of his revenue right now, can't have all of the tinker toys he wants. He needs to moderate his expectations and moderate his spending down to reflect what his reality is. That's what Alaska needs to do. Alaska needs to moderate its spending expectations down to reality.
Don't get me. I agree with you. I mean, I think we need to, like I said, especially the capital budget. I think that's really exploded the last 4 or 5 years. If we would have done what you're suggesting 4 years ago, I mean, I think we'd be in a much better position today. But I'm going to go back to your analogy of somebody in their late 30s and, saving rather than going to Hawaii or buying that four-wheeler. I always love this analogy because sometimes policymakers say, well, budget, every family's got to do their budget, and, if you got to cut out cable TV, you cut out cable TV. But that doesn't apply to a state government or a local government. I mean, your cable bill is education. Your lights are transportation. Your water is prisons. And I see you shaking your head, but I'm going to tell you, Mr. Keithley, as a public policy maker, I look at education. That's an investment to me. That's not an expense. And if we're talking about declining oil and declining natural resources, what replaces that? I would argue that an educated, diverse economy in having the human capital, the intellectual capital, helps that.
You've seen the ICER numbers.
I have.
And you know that we can't tax individuals enough. We can't tax minerals enough. We can't tax tourists enough. We can't tax fish enough. Even if we tax them all, the absolute maximum we possibly can tax them, that isn't enough revenue to sustain this state. The way to sustain the state is to build the 401k account, to build the retirement account that will produce revenue that sustains the state into the future. And we're not talking about, I'm skipping around now, but we're not talking about significant reductions. If you look at the ICER analysis, the sustainable budget number, the number that if we go to spending today and save the remainder and put it into the retirement account, and then that generates a similar amount of revenue in the future, that number is only $5.5 billion. That all to accomplish that number is the number we had just 3 years ago, the level of spending we had just 3 years ago. To accomplish that, to accomplish the sustainable budget, all we got to do is go back 3 years to 5.5.
Okay,
Okay.
let's talk about this. Let you do this after
Sarah, okay.
to allow Representative
Go
Norton.
Now for an optimistic viewpoint. I understand your frustration with the will and sustainability of lawmakers to make good decisions. But I will point you into some facts that when you were in office, I think you were 96?
No, 99 through 2002.
Okay. So in 2001, you were working under 1 million plus barrels of oil flowing through the pipeline. Today, you know what we're working through?
500
No, 480 today. At a price of $110 a barrel. Your price fluctuated, if I look back at the historical source book, between $20 and $25 a barrel. You had a budget much smaller. You had infrastructure that was being built, so your capital budget wasn't as big as ours, but the dollars went farther than they go today. You didn't have an aging population. You didn't have strains on the education system that we have today, which is kids coming to school hungry, not having a family, not being able to get there, not doing all those things possible. But what you didn't have is you didn't have the decline that we're facing today. Not only the decline, but the opportunity to produce more oil. Because as you said, as a chamber president, you should know, people are scared to invest in this state. And you say that we got Century 16 movie theaters and we're getting strip malls. Do you remember the crash of the 80s? You and I were both in high school then.
I do.
Do you remember how many strip malls were empty? Do you know how many banks collapsed? 11. Okay, but let me just finish.
Okay, sure.
I let you finish.
Sure.
But so what the will of the legislators are and the lawmakers are now is this. We're talking about what's going to happen. I have grandbabies. I'm getting ready to have my second grandbaby. And I am scared to death that that grandbaby will move to North Dakota, Australia, wherever the economy is booming and going fresh. So to say that we don't have the fortitude, we are living under completely different circumstances that you were when you were serving in office. We have to make tough decisions. We don't have the luxury. We're robust. $17 billion in savings right now. It's fine, but it is going to go away quickly, and we have to make some realistic cuts. We cannot continue down the path that we're doing. I appreciate your pessimism, but it's not right. The people we wouldn't be sitting here if we were pessimistic. We wouldn't be having this conversation about education funding. We wouldn't be having the conversations in judiciary that we're having about corrections. We understand that the costs are rising. Absolutely. Do you think I liked voting for a $9.4 billion budget? No, it was embarrassing. It was humiliating, frankly.
So why didn't the legislature turn it down?
Because right now, under ACES, we have a ton of money. Nobody sees down the road. I can't go to my district and say, the cliff is coming, because it's been said time and time again. But the reality is we're at 400, a little bit more than 400,000 barrels through the pipeline. We are looking at a HES budget that is phenomenal, to say the least, an education budget that's phenomenal, a corrections budget that's phenomenal. At some point, when you're out of money, you got to cut something. So we're trying to head that off. I mean, that's what we're here for. That's why we talk about, if you look at HB 136, all three of us are on that bill. It's a sustainable budget bill. So we are thinking about it. And you know what? There's going to be failure after failure. But you know what's really going to happen is when we hit that cliff and we don't have any money and you move out of the state and I move out of the state, then somebody will do something. And we're trying to head that off right now, by having these conversations, by doing some budgeting things, by looking at money penny by penny in every single budget, and in creating an investment client so your chamber members won't give up on us and won't be pessimistic on us. I mean, it's tough. You've been a lawmaker before. You understand the pressures. I've heard you talk about some of them right here. But at some point, time out. Can't do that anymore. You've got to move, you've got to have a direction, you've got to look at things like the sustainable budget, like education funding, what's important, what's not important. If we have a healthy education system and we have smart people, but we have no economy, Andrew, where are we going to be? You can have all the smart people living in the state of Alaska, but if you don't have oil production, mineral production, fishing, mining, tourism, because you have no economy, what good is it going to do?
I'll let Mr. Neese, he's been waiting patiently.
I just had a question about one of the charts. Could we go back to the production chart? Because when I was looking at
This
that
one?
one, yeah, thank you. The one on the left, you don't have a timeline on it.
Right.
Is that because oil fields, the length of production is unknown? Or,
No, it's roughly 18 years,
or
roughly
20,
18 to
20,
21.
25 years?
Yeah.
Because I know I've heard the sky is falling since I was riding up here on a Western Airlines aircraft a long time ago. And I think what you're saying is that sustainable is part of the task force title, and it's in there for a reason. And I think the reason is that what you're saying is we can't keep doing what we're doing. What you're saying is we have to change. What you're saying is sky is falling. It'll either fall in 19 or 23.
No, I'm not.
No.
I would disagree with that.
Yeah, but-
I'm not saying the sky is falling. I'm saying there's a way to keep the
But
sky
what
in
you're
place.
saying, you can keep the sky there, you're just going to have to execute some fiscal responsibility.
Right. We're going to have to be a prudent 30-year-old.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a hard sell for some legislators. I think that's going to be a hard sell for the public because that's a lot of money we're talking about. We're spending almost $2 billion on our education system. We don't have that many kids or people living in this state. We can't afford what we're doing right now. Is what I hear you're saying.
Right. But I would disagree. It's not hard because we're really just talking about going back to 2011, FY 2011. I mean, you've got to understand how fast we have escalated spending in this state.
6 years we've escalated it by 3 times.
$2.5 billion in the Murkowski administration, $4.5 billion in the Palin administration up to the first year of the Parnell administration, $6.75 billion in spending in the last 3-4 years. I mean, that's a huge escalation, a huge explosion. It's like a Coke can going off in your hand. All we have to do is put the Coke back in. All we have to do is stop shaking the thing and go back to what we had in FY 2011. It's an easy fix. And if we do that, we have a long-term future. If we don't do that, if we keep shaking the Coke can and keep letting it explode and run all over the place, we don't have a future.
Representative Wilson.
I guess I just want to go a step backwards here. Even if we have all the money in the world, we've been spending more on education, and again, in my opinion, we are still not meeting what most of our expectations are, and that's what we've even heard in the legislature, because there were a few of us that just kept saying we're not, and this wasn't a shot to the teachers or to anybody else, but our students aren't meeting what other students are doing in the U.S. through the NAEP test. So I think one thing we've learned is that money hasn't been the total answer, because if it was, just from what you said, from the increase in education, not even the rest of the budget, we're not seeing our scores going up in relationship to the amount of money. So for me, what this is more of a message of us being more innovative in what we do. I think the easiest approach has always been throw more money at it, hope they go away, and things will be better. Well, I think sometimes when you just throw money at things, it just masks what's out there until the ideas they took it to do. And we've seen it in the energy field, too. We have thrown tons and tons of money toward energy, trying to reduce energy. And part of that's long-term planning. I mean, I totally believe this state is so great, but we don't look out there because we wouldn't still have PCE the way we do, power cost equalization, because that was supposed to be a short-term portion of it. So for me on the sustainability is, I don't think what we're doing is completely working. And I think it's because we say we're individual in the state, but we really still look at all of our problems as we can fix it with one little step. And you're not going to be able to do that. every district's different, even the 5 urban schools. You know, Fairbanks, Anchorage, you know, you're Anchorage, Sue, I'm Fairbanks, and we can take our budgets, one may be bigger than the other, but how we're spending our money in all 3 areas are different, and all of our needs are differently. And so I guess what I've learned in the last couple of days more than anything else is that here's what I haven't learned, what is adequate funding? Because really, that's what we have to figure out. What is adequate funding amongst the money that we currently have? And just because we give adequate funding, is that enough? Because also, as you said earlier, it's the state's responsibility to make sure the education happens, although we give it to local districts. So no matter whether or not we find another big oil field, that oil field will decline after a certain point. So we have to get smart, you know, and think outside just the money issue. Whether it falls tomorrow or 20 years from now, how does technology fit into it? If we get everybody connected, how big's the internet bill going to be then? And this is the thing, as a chair of the subcommittee on education, and I get on education all the time, you constantly start the programs, but nobody ever says what the buy-in is. And if you give it for free, the buy-in is free. And I think that's really, you know, where I think we are in the state right now, is that, yes, if we need programs, we have to come together as a community and determine, is this the program we want, and can we pitch in and pay for it, because we can't continue to give all of our programs without a buy-in from the other communities. And also realize that every community may not be able to give the same amount, but together we can make these programs go. But I think the reason the state's got into this problem is because every time there's an issue, whether it's criminal or whether it's energy, the state steps out there, pours all the money in, and then hopes other people will keep it going when you didn't have the buy-in in the first place. And I think, you know, for our committee, that's what I am hoping that we're going to do, is bring in the superintendents, bring in the principals, but bring in the community. Because I can throw $100 million, and I'm not going to do that to Fairbanks, so don't get off the thing, you know, to Fairbanks. I'll use them because they're my area, and everything will necessarily be okay because I brought in all the experts, because if the community doesn't buy into the change doesn't happen. And I think through even the review of what we've done in the past, the one thing when I did my research I never saw was how are we going to get the communities to buy in. And I really think that's one of the things that, because it takes a lot of time, maybe that's why we haven't done it, but oil will decline. At what rate, everybody can argue, but we know our biggest thing is going to decline, even if the money goes up, so we have to do things differently. You are right. A lot of legislators do not have enough guts, you know, to say we're going to take the hard fall until you have to take it. So for me, at this point, is can we take the money we have and be more wise with it? But I think the answer is going to come, because I think we're in a very smart state. I think it's going to come from the communities. We're just going to have to open everybody else up to say, we need to help do those things, but we get the federal government saying we have to do things this way. Our own state regulations we have to look at this way to figure out whether or not we can make those things happen.
Maybe we should put something on our door this session that says that every ask that came to our office, just start writing it down so people understand what the asks are.
Or ask for community buy-in.
Mr. Halco.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Representative Millett, just a couple of responses, because you gave me facts, now I'm going to give you facts, okay? First off, not only am I the president of the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce, but I see our member surveys. And I have seen our member surveys we do every year for the last 5 years. And education is the top priority, finding an educated workforce. Now,
I don't disagree.
Okay, but I'm going to go back to what you said. Yes, things are different. I mean, we were spending fiscal year '02. The last budget I voted on was $2.8 billion. The last budget you voted on was $6.8 billion. It has increased, and a lot of that increase has been while you're there, and that's not critical. That's like when you're there and there's money, it's easy to spend. Let me get to another point. You listed off the changes compared to 11 years ago when I was in the legislature. Kids showing up hungry, you know, problems, you know, prisons and corrections. So given the dynamic has changed and there are more pressures on society, how do we anticipate holding a flat budget of $5.5 billion when we have all of the challenges and all of the problems, which are growing? How do we realistically sit here and say, okay, this is an option? Again, just one more thing. I'd like to explain my pessimism. not only, I mean, look, I mean, not only am I a former lawmaker during one of the worst, with the exception of the '86 the economic crashes, but we went through the debates. I mean, we made decisions. Basically, we talk about cutting $250 million. We didn't cut $250 million during that 5-year plan. We basically held the cost of government down. But here's my pessimism. And I'm not pessimistic. I mean, I know there's solutions out there, but here's my issue. This task force is incredibly valuable, and I am incredibly honored to be appointed. And I thank you for our conversation, Representative Gaddis. But here's the reality. H.R. 8, the legislation that passed this committee, passed on a vote of 35-1. If you took all of the yay votes, the 35 votes that created this task force, and you multiplied that towards, with each legislative experience, you would have over 220 years of legislative experience analyzing education. Now, if 60 people or 40 people who have had a combined 225 years worth of legislative experience, all of that time, some there more than a decade, to evaluate and figure out education, if they can't do that with 225 years worth of experience, how are the 5 of us going to do it in 3.5 months? And that gets back to my point, is that I think some of these things, like this flat budget and these ideas, ignore reality. And there is, I mean, even back when oil was $9 a barrel and the budget was $2.3 billion, we noticed, we recognized at that time, you couldn't have an income tax high enough. I mean, and we looked at everything, income taxes, real estate taxes, sales tax, and all combined. I agree, you can't make that. But at the same time, you can't just stop funding things like education and corrections and public safety. And I go back, I mean, for the last 10 years, we have had fiscally conservative governors. Murkowski, Palin, Parnell, 3. And all 3 of them came into office saying they were going to reduce the operating budget. It has never been reduced over the last 10 years. I mean, help me out. Where do I see any sunrise on the horizon?
Well, you see a sunrise, you see a sunset, and then you see the sunrise. And here it is.
You see a resurrection at some point in time.
This is the sunset. This is the reality we're facing. Take all of your assumptions. Take that we continue to invest, that there's not a softening of investment. Even take the SB 21 assumption that we're going to have an increased investment, notwithstanding the fact that there's a fiscal crisis out there. Take all of that. We still show up with this gap sometime in the early 2020s. If we're honest with the citizens today and say, you are stealing money from your kids and your grandkids. You are having a fine old time today. You're buying the snow machine, the four-wheeler, the vacation, the new house, the new pickup truck. You're having a fine old time with that, but you're doing it at the expense of your kids and your grandkids not only not having football fields and AstroTurf and tennis courts. But you're doing it at the expense that they're not going to have coaches, they're not going to have uniforms, they're not going to have pads, they're not going to be able to maintain the football fields, and they're not going to have teachers in the classrooms. That's what you're doing today. If you tell the Alaska citizens the truth, which is that's the direction we're going, my belief is they will say, nah, I don't want to go down that road. I need to be fair to my kids and my grandkids, and I need to temper my expectations today, and I need to temper what I'm spending today in order for my kids and my grandkids to have a future. If I'm otherwise wiping out their future, which is where we're going, if I'm otherwise wiping out their future, I will temper my expectations today. Of course we can reduce spending. I mean, $7 million off the top by not doing a tennis court. We can reduce spending. We can reduce education spending by not having the football fields are in the education capital budget. We can reduce education spending by making adjustments that we need to make to get down to real levels so that our kids and our grandkids have a future as well. We're not headed there now. There's a slide on here analysis, or I think I've lost any context or any ability to go through these slides in order. But this is an analysis that ICER and Northern Economics did in February 2011, looking forward, and this was in the context of an analysis of what OCS development would do to the state. This is slide 8, and it's in the context of what OCS development would do. And in analyzing OCS development, which had some relatively minor impact, they looked at what the baseline was without OCS development. And it said 2 options are available to the state in addition to reducing expenditures. 2 options available to the state in addition to reducing expenditures are institution of a broad-based tax and use of a portion of the earnings of the permanent fund. It is anticipated, these are 2 of the best economic minds, economic institutions we got in this state, 2011, it is anticipated that both options, the institution of a broad-based tax and the use of a portion of the earnings of the permanent fund will be required in the non-OCS case. If you add the OCS case, what they said then is you don't have to do one or the other. You don't have to tap the permanent fund, or you don't have to do a broad-based tax. But you're going to have to do at least one, even in the OCS case. So we're headed into a situation where we are failing our kids and we're failing the very people that we're trying to help here. By reforming the education system, we are failing our kids and our grandkids if we don't address the spending situation. If we do address this, so that's the sunset. The sunrise is, if we do address the spending situation, we get down to FY 2011 levels, we institute a sustainable budget, we have not only saved ourselves, but we've saved our kids and our grandkids, and we've put this state in a great situation going forward. And it's not that hard. We go back 3 years, and we do things smarter, we do things better, we do things within a sustainable budget. That is the sunrise. Not just keep on going and hope to hell something happens. We do it in a smart, intelligent way by instituting a sustainable budget. That's the sunrise.
Well said. Mr. Neese.
I loved Aesop's fables, and I'm back to the ant and the grasshopper on this one. So, Mr. Keithley, I mean, that's where we're at. Ant and grasshopper, okay? I'm trying to wrap my head around all the numbers and stuff. So I can't do anything about the rest of the state's spending. The legislators are the ones that do the decision. If the task force looked at the 2010 budget, which is $1,081 million for education, and we said that the analysis of our task force is that for this year's kindergartners that just entered school yesterday, that we will sustain that level of spending for the next 13 years. That would be doing our part of the ant work, because that would just basically say, okay, it's flat funded, 13 years. We'll come back and address it and see how we're doing, and they can work on the other stuff. That's a guarantee to the school districts. It's a guarantee to those parents. But is it enough? That's what I.
Education alone is not enough.
No. I'm just saying, for our task force, sustainable education. Would that sustain education in the state of Alaska for this kindergarten group till they're graduates?
Well, to answer that question, the answer is no. You can't do education in a vacuum. You can't bring education down to FY 2011 levels and have everything else keep on escalating, because that wrecks the state a little bit slower, but it nonetheless wrecks the state. So you've got to bring all of the spend. You got to bring the spending as a whole down to FY 2011 levels. You can't just pick one.
That is the 2011 levels.
Right. But you can't pick just education. It's not enough.
Well, if we back down his, what were the ones? It was prisons and construction.
Yes, education, corrections, and public
Yeah,
safety.
if each of the big spenders, we're 25% of the budget, something like that. If each of the big spenders were to adopt fiscal discipline that way, the cliff goes way far out there. Is that correct?
The cliff goes down. There's one more factor that you've got to deal with, and that's PERS and TERS. because
I was gonna say, we talked about PERS and TERS.
PERS and TERS is sort of a wild card sitting out there, sort of a ticking time bomb that we got to deal with. But we got to deal with PERS and TERS as well as the big spenders. If you do that, then yes, you're getting down the road some. You can't let spending other places pop up.
And working outside of the budget, doing grants, like at my middle school, they replaced all the lockers in the building because they talked to the legislator. And I know various schools that get more grant money because they've got people they know, and I know Title I's aren't getting anything because they don't got anybody who can write the grants.
Well,
So, I mean, it's, if they had the fiscal discipline, if we told the ASD, you will get $300,000 now for the next 13 years, budget, it makes everybody work together. Is that
in a sustainable budget model,
right?
that's doable. I mean, because you have you're putting enough money into the fiscal nest egg and have reasonable expectations of what that nest egg is going to produce. Yeah, you have a predictable revenue stream over an extended period of
I
time.
think that's what the school districts, as far as 28 years in the trenches, that's what I've heard school boards ask for the entire time I've taught is, we need to be able to see the future. They have no control over, if the Air Force relocates an entire fighter wing down here, or if we find a whole bunch of natural gas and cook inlet. We don't have any control over that stuff, but we do have control over the fact that we can say, okay, here is our minimum cut number. We're going to be within a percentage of this for the next 12 years. Essentially, correct?
Right. Yes. You create a lot more certainty in the system. I mean, you don't eliminate all uncertainty, but you certainly create a huge amount of additional of
Right.
certainty.
I look at the formula. We can argue back and forth on the formula because it looks like they've been doing that since 1929. But if according to your sustainable budget model, if
Yeah.
education did its bit, and then all the other departments say, well, education seems to be doing it, then we would have a shot at not going off that cliff. Is that
Yes,
succinct?
yes. This is a chart of what the sustainable budget model does, and it shows, again, green is oil decline, and the light green is new oil, and the blue is gas. The red in this case is the earnings coming from the cash reserve you build up. It's coming from your 401k account, and it doesn't. You see, it extends out to 37. Remember, the red was all consumed by 2023. Otherwise, in a sustainable budget model, you've built up the nest egg. You're producing earnings off that nest egg, and that line, that's 5.5 trended up for inflation. That line continues in perpetuity. So you've created stability and sustainability. You've built a state that not only exists for the next 10 years. You've built a state that exists for the next 50 years.
And you do not, sorry, and you don't have to drop into the reserves and the permanent fund?
No.
And
No.
all the other ICER stuff?
No.
Okay, sorry.
Representative Wilson.
Okay, so I'm not here to save the whole world, just education.
That's what I'm working on.
Okay, so my question is that, okay, so if we went back 3 years on, do you know what the budget was for education 3 years ago? I should know, but I
Got it right
don't.
here.
1.6.
1.6, is that right, Mr.
No,
Neese?
that's according to this, it's, in 2011, it's 1.081.
Oh, no, that would have been that's only the
That's-
formula.
That's the formula stuff, and then it's
Yeah.
like,
So go to page 1 of David's.
okay. So it's 1.6.
1.6. Yeah. It's 1.9 currently. It was 1.6 in FY 2011.
Okay, so, we're basically saying that somehow we want to make sure that we stay within the 1.6 just for education, and I know out of education, you do have the capital budget, so you got a little wiggle room without the turf fields and tennis courts, and I always give my schools all things as well, but
Other stuff.
some of the tweaking in the formula, though, that does change, if our, and we've got the numbers now to analyze, like with the special needs children, the intensive needs, when you're multiplying something by 13, I mean, that's a huge amount at a time. So, just within the formula itself, growing, you can only take so much out of the department to start with. So we have to look at that, correct? But then the other part with the sequestration going on, which is another reason by holding things where we're at, most of that federal funding that's coming in right now is coming into the most neediest students in our state. Because of the Title I programs, especially, and and some of the Title I programs, because of the poverty levels, we might be able to slide on. But if they stop funding the special education ones, then again, it's just a federal government is telling us again what to do, but we're going to do it. They kind of said that today. So we have a much more moving target than some of the others. Now, of course, the prisons, you don't know how many people are going to get. But the courts can make a decision and decide you had to be a bigger criminal to lock you away. We can't really say that in education. We're
Well,
gonna
but
educate.
prisons are based on third grade reading levels. That's how you predict how many prisoners you're going to have, is your third grade reading levels.
Well, exactly.
Raise your
So
reading
there-
levels
so
and
there
you're going to save on prisons.
There you have the connection between education and the other, because the first thing the state's going to do if the crash happens, and they haven't done it in the rest, is you'll probably see the 70-30 program stop. Where they're not going to give 70%, because that's all based on, that's not a guarantee. Everybody thinks it is, but it's not a guarantee. It can happen. So those kinds of things will happen first before it'll happen into the classroom. But how do you write a formula with the issue being you're going to be capped at a certain amount?
Prioritize.
Well, no, you can't. But in a formula, you can't prioritize.
You can with the amount that you.
Well, the formula would trigger off the spending number. It wouldn't trigger off a flat number that would then be adjusted somehow. You'd have a total spending number that's your cap. That's what you're going to spend, and the formula would then fall out of that.
So you would only get that amount of money if that much money was done.
Right.
And then if there wasn't that much, then it would be taken off by a percentage of the rest of it, which means every school district will be more than in my office every day for 90 days. They will be living on my couch every day.
But with all due respect, Representative Wilson, and I know you know this, so I'm preaching to the choir, but with all due respect, they may be living on your couch now. They're going to be living in your office full time in 2023, because there isn't going to be money for basic needs at that point. We're going to be in crash mode with unlike during your era, Representative Halcrow, where we were just waiting for oil prices to recover, with no way out, because we will have had production levels will be at a level where it doesn't matter where the price goes. The price have to go to 200, 250, 300. Ralph Samuels had that during the last campaign, whatever the hell those numbers are. The prices would have to escalate out of sight in order to save us at that point. So it's a pay me now or pay me later. We either moderate now so we have a future, so we have an ability to deal with our kids and our grandkids, and yes, they come see you and you're going to have to deal with them, or in the early 2020s. It's going to be crash mode, and they're going to be all over your office, and everybody's going to be fighting for every last breadcrumb, but there aren't going to be enough breadcrumbs to satisfy anybody.
Follow up? So maybe another part of this discussion has to be along the lines of HFC earlier, where with the capital projects that we do, that we make sure that there's going to be a return on it. So, because most of the capital that we put in is so that we keep our people working, keep those in Alaska working. So if we're putting into projects like a school in which, yes, you have that outlay to start with, but you could save something like 30 to 35%, making sure that the energy project that we do, we're not building a windmill because we don't want to use diesel, but because these savings will happen, because then you kind of get a little shaved off on both sides. You're putting Alaskans to work to do the capital projects, which is why the capital portion is so important to all of us. And if we have some kind of a formula to where it's going to save so much money down those leaner years, if we can't raise the amount of school funding, they actually will have more funding because they're not spending it over here.
Yes.
So I guess, it's more than just with the operating expenses portion of that, but also in the capital, that we're making sure when it goes into the schools or into the buildings, there's a priority on, we're doing these first because we're using state fundings to renovate, but we're also going to get a state return because we're not going to be using
Right.
as much energy. And just a part of helping districts know what their outlay is in the first place could be in an incentive program where if you cut your usage 10 or 20%, we give you extra money. There would be a concept. Why we still have some,
Not extra money, just
Yeah.
not taking that money away from them.
Well, or maybe even an incentive amount of money to say, because sometimes you kind of have to show them there's going to be a return, and sometimes you have to do a short-term incentive so that they see the long-term return. Got to remember, there's a lot of pressure on the schools right now to ask them to start some more new things in hopes that they get somewhere else. I think it would be worth our while to say, this is the reason we're going down that way with an incentive.
Representative Millet.
So, obviously, I'm a big fan of the sustainable budget, and not necessarily as the law of the land, but I think that one of the things that we have a problem with, and Andrew, you didn't have this when you're in the legislature, because you had no money, but now that we have all this money, is talking about what our break-even point is and what is sustainable and what is overspending. Because right now, we walk into a budget cycle, December 15th, the governor hands us a budget, and we just willy-nilly, depending on how much revenue we're bringing in, and I will tell you, ACES was the worst thing that happened to the state of Alaska. Not only did it deter investment, but it made us feel like we had a false economy, like you talked about having a false economy. We had a false sense of stability under ACES that we should have never had. I mean, that's my personal opinion. But going forward, we have to start somewhere by saying, this is what we should be spending. I think it was $5.4 billion last year, based on the ICER study. Whatever it's going to be this year, at least we have a marker. Not only does the legislature have a marker, but the governor has a marker. The administration has a marker. Everybody has a marker of, okay, if we spend above this, knowingly spend above this, we are determining that later on in our children's and our grandchildren's lives, we are harming them. And we have a public information problem because the public sees that we're bringing in billions and billions of dollars in oil revenue under ACES, and there is no problem. I have people at my door all the time that say, we don't have a problem. We have a lot of money. We have oil money coming in right and left. We do. Absolutely we do. But what did we trade off for those billions and billions and billions of dollars for the next generations? And that's what keeps me up at night. That's what worries me. I am scared to death that the harm I may do in the legislature will be 10 times as bad for my grandson when he's here and there's nothing here for him. And so we have to start somewhere. I like the idea of a sustainable budget. We have to have, and I would imagine that as a business owner, we've all been in business and we've all owned a business, you forecast your budgets. We don't. We forecast our spending. And that's a fundamental flaw in the way we do our budgeting in the state of Alaska. You know what? We forecast budgets. We don't forecast what is sustainable. And I think we need a value shift in our whole philosophy. And I don't think education is going to suffer. I think we're going to be more efficient. You know, I can give you example after example where the state gives money, grant money, and in reality, we should be giving low-interest loans or zero-interest loans, but we should be getting a return on our investment. You're exactly right. What programs are working and what programs aren't? You know, what is a want versus what is a need? We never have those conversations when the capital budget comes through. You know, it's, one legislator of 60 saying this is what I want from my district and this is what the people are telling me. And at some point in time, we have to have the fortitude to say, generationally, that's not going to help anybody down the road. The tennis courts are not going to help the next generation. So I think Andrew, you're right. It's tough to be a legislator, but
Nobody's going to come ask for tennis courts in a long time.
or football fields. I mean, Brad. But so anyway, I mean, I just think that we have to have an honest conversation with not only our colleagues but with the public about what we're putting in jeopardy if we don't, budget like we would budget a business.
I agree. Sometimes I feel like Ross Perot in 1992, carrying around my little charts and trying to explain, what's going on with the government. This chart, I think, is a chart that if there were any way to get it in every Alaskan's hands and explain what we're doing, it would be well worth the effort. Because once you see this chart, and once you see what we're doing to future generations, it becomes immediately obvious the trade-off we're making. That we're making our lives better. We're creating the bubble that you talked about earlier. We're creating a bubble for ourselves at the expense of our children and our grandchildren. And I feel to my bones that if we tell Alaskans that's what we're doing, but we've got a plan to soften what we're doing for ourselves, but to give our children and our grandchildren the same life that we've given ourselves, I think Alaskans will choose to do that.
It's going to hurt.
Just to follow, excuse me. I guess, as I said, being a veteran of these fiscal policy wars, I mean, even getting something to the floor and having to vote on something like an income tax, it's not easy. I mean, I don't disagree. Here's my frustration. Not only as my current occupation, my family owns a large business with 120 employees in 11 different cities. The economy in this state and education and government services are incredibly important because I've been from doing business in Fairbanks to Petersburg, and I know what the state contributions create to the local economies, okay? So part of my frustration is we have known this. I mean, Ralph Samuels talked about this in 2008, that at existing spending levels by 2015, oil would have to be $150 a barrel. I mean, Ralph ran that course his entire primary campaign. So we've known this for now 5 years. And so when I look in the rearview mirror as a business owner and business executive, what I see is I see the legislature for the last 5 or 6 years has spent willy-nilly, has not exercised any self-control, and we've seen this coming. So now, when I look at your presentation, and again, I love Scott Goldsmith, I don't dispute his numbers, so now what the state is faced for, because we went through this 5 or 6 years of spending frenzy, now what we're saying is, okay, starting next year, for the next 5 years, education is going to be flat funded. I mean, so the children in schools, and I'm not trying to be overly dramatic, but the students, because of a lack of investment on a yearly basis, even a little bit, if we hold it, are paying the cost because of basically 6 years of legislative indulgence.
I don't disagree with that at all. If we'd started 5 years ago, we'd be better off. The sustainable budget number would be 6+ instead of 5.5. We spent it. We spent it away. I mean, we could have a lot better future. But that doesn't mean we don't do it now. That doesn't mean, well, we blew it for the last 5 years, so let's blow it for 5 more years. That means, yeah, it's tough. We should have done it before. We should have stepped up. We would have had a better life for ourselves and for our kids and our grandkids if we had, but we didn't. But we have the opportunity to do it now. We have the opportunity to do it based upon the revenues that we can see over the next few years. If we don't do it now, we don't have the opportunity. There won't be enough revenues to save to give us the sustainable budget out into the future. The sustainable number, if we don't do it now, if we wait 5 more years, the sustainable number is going to be 2.5 as opposed to 5.5. So I understand the frustration of not having done it for the last 5 years. And if we had a time machine, we could go back and correct it, but we can't. But we have to do it now.
Help us, help you, Andrew.
Mr. Covey.
I have my own suggestions.
Mr. Covey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I listen to all this, and I look at the education system, and I believe we do have options. Right now, if you take one group of our students, Alaska Native students, we graduate 50% of that group of students in 4 years. That's the equivalent of losing 1 out of every 2 gallons of oil out of the pipeline. It's been going on for decades. We have programs that are graduating over 90% of Alaska Native students, 80% of Alaska Native students. They've been going on for decades. But they're small. We can recreate, we can redevelop, and we can deliver programs like that, and we can increase that graduation rate dramatically. And the costs aren't that great. We don't have to build new systems. We have to redirect resources to do it. And we have the capacity. Chugach School District serves right now 250 students a year. They take not the high flyers. Many of their kids that come through this program are in danger of not graduating from high school. That's why they come in. They come in for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks. 97% of the kids have graduated since 2003 through this last year. 97% graduate. 92% have a job, go in the military, or go to college. Now, these are kids that were going to drop out of the system. We have programs like that in pockets around the state. That program is in its 17th year. It has never, other than capital funding to build a dorm, it has never had a dollar of state operating funds. It will have, based upon the changes that you made last session beginning next year. It will cost, to run students through that residential program, the stipend will be less than $500,000 a year. The capital is there, the program is there. It's not that big of an expense. I mean, what I'm hearing you say is, let's not buy a new car, let's fix our car and let's drive our car, because it's a good car. And I think we can do that, at least within education. I don't know about the rest, but there are many things we can do. I think our education system, our education workforce is a good workforce. Our teachers are just as good as teachers anywhere in this world. Our whole system, we have 350 school board members that care. They work hard. It's just our collective decision-making about what are we going to do, what type of discipline are we going to have to accomplish what our priorities are. And when I hear people saying, well, let's just say this is it. I mean, that's what happens at home, right? We've got this much money. We're not going to the movie. We're not going on vacation. We're going to stay within our bounds. And we do that. We can do it as a state with our education system as well. And if we spend more over here, then we just have to spend less over here. So, thank you.
Very well said. And I think that we look at our own, and just to piggyback on that, our own budgets. If we're not going to the movie theater, maybe we're renting a movie and popping our own popcorn in our microwave, So it is just where we spend the money and how we pivot over and use the programs. And I think that's one of the things that we're looking at. And I think we did a pretty good job of getting to this point the last couple of days as we processed where we've been, where we are, and of course, as we go on, where we're going to go. And although it's a somewhat heated conversation, it had to be, it's a great conversation, and I'm glad that we all just didn't nod our heads and carry on. I'm glad that there was good conversation back and forth, because I think it brings it to a forefront where we are and why we're sitting here today. And certainly I would have to agree with you that education shouldn't be the only thing that we're looking at either pivoting or cutting. And of course, as a group, I think that we've got some very wise people, some very learned people, some very well-studied people on this group, and I think we're going to make some very, very good decisions on how we pivot and in what direction that we go. So I'm very, very appreciative, and I'm not entirely sure. Are you done?
I am done.
Okay. I was just-
Believe it or not, we
I
got through
dared not
most of
even
the
ask.
slides.
Andrew, I wasn't being mean to you, we're just trying to.
No.
I'm passionate about this.
Me too.
I'm passionate about this conversation. I really am, because we still have the scars from the last go around. But my experience during those times in seeing what lawmakers were willing to do. We all talk big, right? But when you get down to voting, it's like, I don't know, I got to vote with the majority, right? So that's what I base my pessimism. And I also, again, when I hear that, okay,
we're in tough situations, so we're going to flat fund education, and I know a number of folks have used the personal budget. Let me put a twist on a personal budget. So you're a family of four, husband, wife, 2 kids. Great. You're not going to go to the movies.